Before I get into the next section, I just wanted to mention probably one of the most famous dependent adult abuse cases that we've had nationally this past year, Mickey Rooney. Now, some of you are going to say, who's Mickey Rooney? Depends on your age category. Probably the last movie I'm aware of was Night at the Museum. He was one of the bad guys, the real tough attitude. Mickey was actually being abused by a stepson, and he has become kind of the poster adult for elder abuse nationwide. And so, famous people get abused too. We're going to talk about, what isn't dependent adult abuse. Just like with child abuse, if the family, the caretakers do not have the resources or the services are not available, it would not be dependent adult abuse. Same thing with religious belief. If the basis for not doing the care, not having services is based on a legitimate religion, it has to be the legitimate religion of the dependent adult. Now, it might be the religious belief of the caretaker also, but it has to be the religious belief of the dependent adult. And then, just like with child abuse, it has to be legitimate. It cannot be the Portland, Oregon Church of the Body Piercings. Okay. Something else that's counted under that is consent. If, in fact, if I make a statement to someone that if anything happens to me, I don't want life support and I don't want to be on a ventilator, if I have made those statements, if I have come up with written a living will, if I have a durable power of attorney for health care, so therefore I have consented to things, either what I want or what I don't want, then that would not be abuse if people are following my wishes, implied consent or actual written consent. When we're talking about a terminal illness, if the rationale for not doing services or not continuing any type of care is based on a terminal illness, in fact, it has to be a terminal illness and in a terminal state, which is generally considered that last 6 months or that hospice period of time. I had a daughter tell me once, she said, just leave my mom alone. You poke her and you prod her and you do all these horrible tests to her. She's terminally ill with breast cancer. Let her go. Her mom didn't have breast cancer, let alone be terminal. We had just started the diagnosing at the hospital. If we had believed the daughter and had backed out on that, she could have taken her mom anywhere she wanted to and done anything she wanted to do with her because there wouldn't have been anybody available to interact on that. When we're talking about domestic abuse versus domestic violence, in Iowa, domestic abuse is under dependent adult abuse. Domestic violence is criminal code. So then it gets back to the 3 pieces that you need. If one of the couple is a dependent adult, if the spouse is the caretaker and the abuse is happening, that's going to fit dependent adult abuse. If one of the spouses is a dependent adult, but the other spouse is not functioning as the caretaker, that goes to criminal code, domestic violence, because you don't have the pieces to have it dependent adult abuse. Anytime somebody is already involved in the penal system, so the Department of Corrections is already involved with them, yes, they may become a dependent adult in prison or in jail. If they're serving a life sentence, they're going to become dependent at some point in time, but they're going to stay criminal law. They will not jump back into the civil side of it with dependent adult abuse. So why does abuse occur? Retaliation is up there, number 1. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the number 1 cause of abuse. But the University of Delaware did a study that if we grow up in a non-violent, non-abusive household, the chances of us becoming an abusive adult is 1 in 400. The same study showed that if we grow up in a violent, abusive household, the ratio changes to 1 in 2. 50% chance of becoming an abusive adult if that's our background. So retaliation can be a big part of it. For the fun of it, I don't know if any of you tracked what happened in Albert Lea, Minnesota. They had a nursing facility that had a memory care. 100% of the residents of memory care had to have some type of dementia. Most of them were Alzheimer's specific. There were 4 young ladies that were having a contest to see who could be the most abusive to the residents of memory care. The residents that couldn't talk back, that couldn't report that what was happening, all they could do was to begin to act out. So suddenly the residents' behavior was changing. Staff couldn't figure out what was going on. What was going on was 4 young ladies having a contest to see who could be the most abusive for the fun of it. As far as violence as a way of life, there are people that are going to swing first and ask questions later. That doesn't mean it's right, but that sometimes is their reaction to stress, and it's going to be a problem when we're talking about dependent adult abuse. Lack of conflict resolution. Most of the time we don't think about things in our past that hurt us physically or hurt us emotionally or mentally. But when you're in the stress of caregiving, those things from your past are going to come rolling out, and they're going to impact that care relationship with the dependent adult. When we're talking about lack of close family ties, we have a unique situation in Iowa where we have more people over the age of 75 moving back to Iowa than any other age. For the most part, they're the people who lived here, retired, became snowbirds, and went south. You know, they have a whole new social circle, all new friends and activities, and then a spouse dies. And out of that new social circle, another. Pretty quick, they're all singles. And instead of staying there and being snowbirds, they're coming home. They're coming home just about the time that maybe they don't have adult children that can help them out. A lot of their friends they have lost, or they have moved out of town. Or they're moving home just about the time their adult children are becoming snowbirds. And so they're coming back without that good, solid support system. Anytime you're talking finances, you could potentially be talking a problem when we're talking dependent adult abuse. Whether we are talking about actual theft, and we'll be discussing financial exploitation, greed, the statement, follow the money, how true. Almost every type of abuse, you could also find a financial problem there, so follow the money. When we're talking about resentment of dependency, that can go both ways. Especially in family caregiving, if you are a caretaker trying to take care of a dependent, do you know how tough it is to get 2 hours off to go out to dinner? You want to go out to dinner and you want to go to a movie? Probably not going to happen. Vacation? There just are not enough persons to give you a break for 2 hours, 4 hours, 2 weeks vacation time. The stressors just continue to climb. But what about the dependent adult? If as a diabetic I've lost a leg, I can be royally ticked off. Not only have I lost a leg, but because of health challenges, I have to have help putting a prosthesis on. I can't get it on by myself. I'm not even allowed to take a bath by myself anymore because I'm not safe getting in and out of that bathtub. Somebody's got to hang on to me because I only have one leg. They took away my car. And so the dependent adult can be just as ticked off as the caretakers can be. So now you've got both sides into it. You've got a problem with that abuse. And then when we're talking about life expectancy, Iowa is known as a state of older adults. Until it's probably been 1.5 years ago now, we had the oldest living American. She was 114 and she lived in Ames. We are known as a state of older adults. And then when you look at the last 3 that are on the list, mental and emotional problems, that can easily be on both sides of it. Alcoholism, alcohol problems can be on both sides, a dependent adult and the caretaker involved. Drug abuse. There are more persons over the age of 75 addicted to actual prescription legal drugs than any other age category. But what about illegal drugs? What makes us think just because somebody survived the 60s and 70s and have become an older adult that they've stopped using illegal drugs? Most of them that survived PCP, LSD, angel dust, pot, most of them have switched to methamphetamine. They're still using illegal drugs, even as an older adult. And then unemployment. Most of us are still into thinking about elders and older people. Most of us don't think about employment. I have a coworker that's 80 and 2 coworkers that are 79 that still work full-time. I don't want to still be working at those ages. Main reason they still do? Health insurance. Yeah? And so it can be a problem. But then what about the 24-year-old with severe cerebral palsy? Physically very challenged, mentally very alert, has a full-time job and suddenly loses the job. How's he going to pay for services? How's he going to function? What's going to be there as far as the abuse between him and a caretaker or anyone that is in his world? And then I said that abuse wasn't reported. 84% of the time it's not reported. Number 1, family secrecy. Now, it could be that retaliation, IBU when you were a child, Nobody reported me. Now, I'm abusing, you're abusing me, nobody's going to rat you out either. And so that family secrecy can be part of it. It could also be the fact of, I know in my household growing up, what happens here stays here. It wasn't that it was any secret, it just wasn't anybody's business what was going on in our household. When we're talking about self-blame, that can go with retaliation. It's my fault you're beating me because I beat you. But it can also be with dependency. It's my fault I'm a dependent adult. I didn't pay attention to the doctor's orders. I didn't eat right. It's my fault I lost my leg. When you're talking about isolation is a great technique. If you can get anybody separated, isolated from telephone calls, from visitors, you can pretty much do what you want to do with them. Fear is very, very real. Harvey was afraid every day that he had left that he was going to be beaten to death, and he was. And then embarrassment. When we're talking about embarrassment, we generally are talking about women over the age of 75 and sexual abuse. How many of you ever went up to your grandma and said, hey, Grandma, let's talk about sex? I very seldom ever come across anybody that says yes to that. Most of the time, we would be too embarrassed to talk to our grandmother about sex. Your grandmother, most of the time, is going to be, embarrassed talking to you about it. And so unless your grandmother is the person, that reared you and taught you the facts of life, that communication, that conversation hasn't happened. And so most older women are not used to reading sexually explicit material. They're not used to watching sexually explicit movies. They're very embarrassed to discuss sexual activity. Most of them, their sexual orientation started on their wedding night. But the number one reason why people will not report abuse, they do not want to be institutionalized. They don't care how bad it is at home. It's still better than if it would be in any type of an institution. Something that we haven't known a lot about is, when does abuse start? University of Arizona did a study that actually proved that abuse can start in a prenatal phase. So when we are talking about a fetus who by law is not a child yet. Okay, and what they showed, let's talk about mom and dad that are the violent people. Every time, mom's pregnant, every time they get into it, mom's adrenaline level spikes. Adrenaline strikes the central nervous system of the fetus, who's not a child. How much damage can that do? If the car jack brakes and the car drops on your best friend, adrenaline is what gives you the strength to lift that car off of your friend. That chemical is hitting the central nervous system of a fetus. And what they could prove is they were actually being programmed into an abusive cycle. That child being abused, subsequent children. Those children involved. Difference between sibling rivalry and sibling violence. We don't think about those things, but it can easily step over the line into violence if that is the family pattern. Courtship problems. One study, 25% of the 16-year-olds reported date rape. Iowa Department of Public Health, a couple years ago, 11% of Iowa teenagers reported physical violence during dating. And then you have spousal abuse, domestic violence, domestic abuse, we have elder abuse, we have dependent adult. It literally goes full circle. And something else that we haven't paid attention to, a lot of attention, and part of it is because people don't want to talk about disabilities and abuse. Persons that do have that label of a disability, they don't want another label, disabled and abused. But what we do know is, why do perpetrators abuse other people? Because perpetrators, if you can get them talking, they like to share what's going on. If in fact they're considering a person a disabled person, could easily consider that they are not a human being. And I know medicine, we actually perpetrated that for a while. As a student nurse, and for a few years after I graduated, if we didn't use the phrase persistent vegetative state. We called people vegetables. So if I'm talking to a coworker about Mr. Smith in 201 bed 1, I might refer to him as a vegetable. Inappropriate, but I might have referred to him that way. Just as a perpetrator walks down the hall, to the perpetrator, what's the difference between a head of cauliflower and Mr. Smith? There isn't any. They're both vegetables. And so if they're not human, then they are merchandise and they are damaged. If you have a broken toaster, you have options. You can do what you want to do with a broken toaster. You could obviously take it back. But I actually know somebody that wrapped up a damaged toaster and gave it as a wedding gift. Now it's their problem to take it back. Perpetrators do bizarre things too to other humans. As far as some of the other things, as far as feels no pain, I saw a guy just reach out and he just slapped this young man one day. He said, see there, he didn't feel that. He didn't even move. The fact that he didn't respond to it doesn't mean he didn't feel it. I had somebody else say, hey, I could tell by the look in his eyes he was going to take a swing at me. He's got a history of violence, self-defense. I just hit him first. And the last one, helplessness. Sometimes we're the problem. There are times that we jump in to help somebody that is quite capable of doing it themselves. We haven't given them the time or the ability to do that. And what we have just done is painted a bullseye on them. Hey, come and get them. We have a dependent person over here. And so sometimes we're the one that points them out to a perpetrator. 54 million people in the United States with a label of disability. 18% of Iowa population have that disability label. 58% of Iowa's homeless population have a long-term disability. And so we are dealing with persons with disabilities every day. So they're very, very prone to being abused by anyone around them. 4 to 10 times more likely to be abused than the general population. Underemployment, unemployment, where are they going to live? How are they going to take care of? How are they going to get services? And unfortunately, a lot of them, that's why they are homeless, or they're living in high-risk areas because it's all that they can afford. Women are victims more often than men. Traumatic brain injury, it adds just another whole level to the problem. Most persons with a traumatic brain injury started life as, quote, normal. They still remember how to socialize, they still want to be involved, but suddenly they just don't fit in. And so once again, they're going to end up with some really risky behaviors, a lot of alcohol, a lot of substance abuse problems. And then men are more likely to be abusive to women with disabilities than vice versa. Perpetrators groom victims. We talked about perpetrators grooming victims with child abuse. Perpetrators groom victims with dependent adult abuse too. A lot of times it starts as something just as simple as a smile. And if you think about being isolated by illness, health challenges, even within behavior disorders, problems, being isolated in your own home, a caretaker home, a facility, sometimes that smile is the only one you've gotten that day. And then the next step usually is, hey, hi, Di, how are you doing? Somebody called me by name. They actually remembered what my name was. And then touch, shake my hand, give me a pat, quick squeeze, a kiss on my cheek. Touch, other than caregiving touch, is frequently absent. And then it's usually a gift, flowers or candy. I've been set up. I now have a best friend. They smile at me, they call me by name, they touch me, and they give me things. And the 2 times that are the most risky, one is bathing. Usually we hear, Di, you'd sleep a lot better tonight if you had your bath in the evening instead of in the morning. Hey, this is my best friend. I just trust them. And so we switch my bath to a time when, it doesn't matter whether it's at home with home type of services or whether it's in a facility. Lights are usually down. There's fewer visitors, fewer phone calls during that time. One-on-one, nudity involved, and abuse occurs. The second most risky time is with transportation. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking private vehicle, a city bus transit system, a cab, a facility van. It doesn't matter. Usually it's, hey, Di, I've got something I want to show you. Let's get everybody else, at their home or back to the facility, wherever they're going. I've got something I want to show you. I trust this person. They're my best friend. Now I'm one-on-one in a moving vehicle with a perpetrator, and they can take me anywhere they want to take me. We had the 5 offender categories earlier when we were talking about child abuse. A few differences with it. We don't realize how easy it is to step over that line. My husband had a heart attack and a stroke when he was 43. I was a director of nursing at the time, so I had a fairly responsible job. We had 5 kids, 18 years and younger. So we had actual children living in our home. We suddenly had half the income to work with and a 100% disabled spouse. Even though this is my field and has been my field for over 30 years, it took everything I had in me to keep from saying something I shouldn't have said to swing back, because physical violence had become part of that relationship where it never had been before. As far as being overwhelmed but ignorant, that one horrible foot that I said I would say something about, he was a dependent adult, but he could take his own bath. The fact that he ran the bath water too hot, the fact he stepped into the bath water and burned both feet was his problem, not the problem of a caretaker. But the caretaker, knowing the burns needed to be kept clean, scrubbed them with Comet. Well-intentioned, ignorant caregiver. But unwilling could care less. I was doing orientation one day, and I had this young man in my office. He actually had his feet, both of his feet up on my desk. He had his chair tipped back on the back legs. He had his arms crossed across his chest, and he had his eyes closed. And I took it for a minute, and I finally said, "Excuse me, young man, am I boring you?" He said, "Lady, you are the most boring thing I have heard in my life." Whoa, I was hot. It was a direct insult. But you know what I was really angry about? He'd been hired. He had absolutely no business. If he can't sit still through orientation to pay attention to what's going to happen with his job, what's he going to do working with dependent adults? We had the wrong person for the job. The good news was he only lasted the next 15 minutes. He didn't complete orientation. The last two categories, the abusive and the sadistic personalities, these are the same people for children as they are for adults. I have already said you're going to find all 5 categories everywhere you find children, everywhere you find dependent adults, including potentially where you work. The scary news about the last 2 categories, they usually are very good caregivers. Doesn't make a lot of sense until you think about it. If somebody reports them for being abusive, and we have the evidence, their name is going to be on an abuse registry for the next 10 years. It's part of a criminal background check. They will not get to work with children or adults. In a lot of places, they are not going to be able to go into medical professions and other fields of practice because they have a positive hit on the registry. And so they are very good at giving care to hide what they really want to do, which is to abuse dependent adults. There are 6 different types of abuse for dependent adults, and we're going to take them individually. You're going to notice that some of the same, some of the language, the words the same, and so we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. The physical abuse, at variance with history. Stories don't match. That one slide that I said was a fist directly to the chest. The dependent adult said the caretaker had hit her in the chest with his fist while she was taking a nap. The caretaker said that didn't happen. She has Alzheimer's, you know. She's very confused. She rolled out of bed and landed on her shoe. She didn't have Alzheimer's. She wasn't disoriented. Her story was what had happened. So histories don't match. We find more dependent adults locked up, chained, tied up, confined than we find children. We find medications used for control more often with adults than we find with children. Sometimes it's a bribe. You know, Di, if you do what I want you to do, I'll give you more pain medication. It can be a threat. If you don't do what I want you to do, I'm not giving you your pain medication. Or I'm quite frankly tired of taking care of you, and they're over-medicated. You know, so medications are used a lot more often with adults. And then obviously with physical injury, it can go all the way into your criminal charges and your assault. The same language, willful, negligent acts, omissions, you could be just as guilty. Something that was added in 2008 was breach of skill or care. If you have a profession, you are trained to do a position, a job, a field, and you fail to do that, you fail to comply with your protocols, your skill, your care knowledge, you can be charged with physical abuse by breach of skill or care. This is the same stair steps that you saw earlier, some differences with it. Scratches, cuts, and bruises. I had a guy come into one of my programs. From collarbone to belt buckle, from shoulder to shoulder, he was a mass of perfectly symmetrical 1-inch slashes. He looked like he'd been in a fight with a razor blade and had lost the war. I didn't ask him what happened or who did it. I just said, "Can you tell me about this?" And he pushed himself back and he held out his hands and he said, "My son didn't do it. It's not abuse." Well, of course it was abuse, and now I knew who had done it. Unfortunately, he was dead the next morning with massive internal injuries. The emergency room physician refused to get involved, refused to call law enforcement, and refused to file a dependent adult abuse report. He wrote down the cause of death as cardiac arrest, and the son got away with murder. That's not legal, but things like that, unfortunately, still happen. Burns look the same for adults as they do with children. Gag marks can be the same. Sprains, hypothermia. There are a lot of dependent adults that are very frail, have become cold. They're losing their fat pads, their circulation isn't as good, and so they can become very, very cold. My mom had died early on, and my dad had remarried, and they lived in Arizona. It was August. I went to visit. It was 112 degrees outside. I considered that hot, and it was like 2:30 in the afternoon, and my stepmother said, "Bill, do you think it's warm enough in here to turn off the furnace?" They had their furnace running in August with 112-degree heat because my dad was cold. So that would not be an abusive situation, except possibly to me. But an abuse situation that happened in north central Iowa. There was an Alzheimer's victim who screamed, and she was being taken care of by her family at home. And they got tired of listening to her. So they tied her to a kitchen chair out in the middle of the backyard in the winter, assuming that because they couldn't hear her any longer, no one else would hear her. Fortunately, somebody going in and out of their house to the store heard her screaming and got help for her. And so we can have hypothermia that is deliberately, it is an abusive action. Starvation, dehydration, contractures, those are the same. Detached retina. The number one cause of detached retina in a dependent adult is diabetes, not an abusive action. But the second cause of a detached retina in an adult is a direct blow to the head. Tipped over into a chair where they hit the floor. It could be getting hit with a pot or a pan from the kitchen, getting whopped with a book. It's that direct blow to the head. You saw pictures of the pressure sores that can be very horrendous and do not heal. Choke marks are the same. When you jump to murder and death, there are law enforcement officers in different states now that are starting to charge what they're calling gray murder. That they have people, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the gray hair. It could be that they are younger people, but they're very fragile, frail people that are being neglected, to the point that they are dying of a urinary tract infection, they're dying of pneumonia, they're dying of wound infections, where had they had proper care, they would not have died. And so there are law enforcement departments that are starting to charge gray murder, homicides. Iowa isn't that far yet. I was asked to serve as a consultant for a community in Iowa. They had a situation where the husband was a dependent adult and his wife was his caretaker, so that fits dependent adult abuse. She got tired of taking care of him. He was early Alzheimer's, so he was having problems with being incontinent and involuntary, and he also paced a lot. He was sundowning with it. So she quit changing his clothes and quit dressing him. It was easier than doing all of that laundry. She quit making the bed because she didn't want the hassle of washing sheets and blankets. She put a plastic mattress pad down on the bed and she used kitty litter. It does everything the ads say. It's super for absorbency, great for odor control. All she had to do was scrape it up and throw it away, put down new kitty litter. Can you imagine sleeping on kitty litter? She would take the dog out for a walk, and when she'd bring the dog back in, she'd leave the 3-foot leash attached to its collar. Now if her husband were to trip over the leash, die, break a neck and die, who are you going to blame? She would take little 3- and 4-day vacations. So she would leave the dog and her husband in the house. So now you've got man and animal not going out for a walk, not being taken care of. The locks were on the outside of their house to keep them in instead of on the inside to keep the world out. And also when she took vacations, she didn't leave anything to eat or drink in the house. It was during one of her vacations that the town became aware that they had a problem. He couldn't find anything to eat or drink, but he remembered that there was a building down the street that meant food. He couldn't remember Golden Arches. He couldn't remember McDonald's. He just remembered it meant food, and he jimmied a window and he escaped. If he'd been wearing clothes, he would have become a different statistic. He could easily have wandered off. They wouldn't have found him and he could have died. But because he was nude, they found him within half a block at home. When they got him back home, that's when they found the locks, the no clothes, the kitty litter, the dog leash. But on the countertops in the kitchen were multiple bottles of alcohol with all the lids off, multiple bottles of prescription drugs for different patients, pharmacies, doctors, and towns. All the child-proof caps were gone, and next to that was an open box of rat poison. If he hadn't remembered McDonald's, which wasn't even down the street, he just thought it was, if he hadn't jimmied a window and escaped, there's a good probability he would have consumed a combination. He would have died of either a cardiac or a respiratory arrest. She would have been able to get home, get everything cleaned up before she called for help. With an Alzheimer's diagnosis, there's a good probability he would not have been autopsied and she would have gotten away with murder. Just like with child abuse, sometimes it starts at the bottom, sometimes it starts at the top. Sometimes the bottom is the cause for the top with the murder and death. A wide variety. Police departments actually like this scale. I was talking about the dating of bruises, and it really isn't scientific. But from the standpoint of them being able to look at something and say a time frame with the colors of bruises, they like it. Medical professionals, we're not so hot on it. It's like, okay, what's their diet? What's their diagnosis? What medications are they on? We kind of want to complicate it. You know, you do have access. You would have access to different handouts. You would have access to a full body graph. You know, that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You know, take time if you're really even questioning whether you should report it. But even if you're planning to report, take time to draw it out. You know, you're going to think about it and say, we really do need to do something about this. If you look at different ways that it has been done, if you look at the damage, you know, there's very little color or rainbow effect with this. But look where the damage is. All of the damage is mid-chest, mid-back up. This person was being abused when they were seated in a wheelchair. A medical professional filled this one out, you know, so they weren't using any colors at all. They were using medical terminology. But look at, there's hardly any part of the body that isn't damaged. And we have some major damage, including a fracture of a femur with it. And so there's some major damage there that's obvious when you draw it out. Not a lot of damage, but a lot of color. But we also have a time span. Well, they fell and they hit their head a month ago. They still have a lump. How long has their finger been infected? Well, they cut it about a week ago. So you have a 3-week span of time. And when you go back to the color scale, the 3 weeks match. So there is some validity to it. This one I will always regret. I don't think I could have done anything different, but it's one of those that I never know. Severe Alzheimer's, living with a 5-generation family. They did a pretty good job taking care of her at first. And then she fell when they were taking her for a walk, and she broke the bones of her hand and her wrist. They took her to the emergency room. The surgeon repaired the fractures and put her in a cast in May. When I saw her again, it was August. The cast had still been in place. She had never been back to see the doctor. The only reason they took her back to the doctor that day, the infection under the cast was so severe, the smell bothered the family. They took her to the doctor. That was a physician that knew what his responsibilities were. He started the dependent adult abuse report. He said, Di, take care of her. You know, the only way you can keep someone in a place against their will is either with a guardianship or a court order. The only way you can get somebody out against their will is with a guardianship or a court order. I never assumed, I had never attempted any type of a court order. I never assumed I would need one. About an hour and a half after we started taking care of her, her guardian, who was one of this 5-generation families, came in and legally removed her from the hospital. Took her out of state. There was no follow-up. The possibility of survival was probably less than 6 months. When we're talking about sexual abuse of dependent adults, those are the same criminal codes for child abuse, because there is not a civil definition of sexual assault. So they are criminal codes, they are the same. Some of the subcategories for dependent adults are even similar or the same as they are for child abuse. But there is a type of sexual assault, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation that is with adults that we don't have in the child abuse code, and that is sexual exploitation. And basically what it means is you cannot have a job where you are paid to take care of a dependent adult and have sex with them. It's against the law. You cannot get paid to do a job and have sex with the person you're paid to take care of. But we've heard the stories, therapists, counselors, medical professionals, that in fact do violate the law. Something else that has been added, it was added in 2009, was transmission, display, taking electronic images of any sexually oriented parts of the body. There are medical programs and facilities in the state now that are banning cell phones, cameras, etc. You leave it in the car, you leave it in your locker, that they are not actually allowed to have cell phones or cameras on their body on duty because they are taking inappropriate photos and passing them to computers, other phones, cell phones, etc. So as of 2009, that's a new piece of the law. 99% of persons with developmental disabilities have never had sex education. So how are they going to tell us when they're being abused, when there's a sexual violation there? How are they going to tell us if we haven't given them the skills and the language they need? I know a young man who reported that someone was touching the thing that makes the water yellow. That's a pretty good description. But unfortunately, if you're not thinking about what that person said, or you're thinking about a disability, you may miss it. Had a young lady reporting that somebody was touching her pocketbook, and a caretaker said, then leave it in your room. She wasn't talking about her purse, she was talking about her body. When she'd been masturbating as a little kid, a caretaker said, don't touch your pocketbook. Wrong information. How is she going to tell us when there's a problem? Well, I had a 24-year-old said that she had been raped at night by a caretaker. The comment back was, what does she know? She's a retard. If anybody had bothered to read her social history, they would have known she was a victim of incest with her father from the time she was a tiny child. She knew what had happened to her. She knew what she needed to do. She needed to make that report. And so unfortunately, we are not protecting them. Persons with developmental disabilities are abused more often and most often out of all the categories of disability. Sex doesn't just happen. There's some thought to it. But unfortunately, when we're really thinking about it, especially persons with developmental disabilities, we have a tendency to blame the victim rather than really thinking through what's going on. Who's the perpetrator? What was their thought about this happening? And so unfortunately, it's a category of people that are being abused. When we're talking about sexual activity and the difference with frailty and age, we already touched base with lack of a good support system. We already talked about beliefs, especially with older women, in sexual activity. So they're not something that they're not going to be talking to us about. They have a different thought pattern with it. But if you think about any type of sexual abuse, it's going to complicate existing illnesses. The tolerance to the sexual activity isn't going to be as good. It's going to be a longer recovery period. There's going to be more injury, more bruising, more tearing, more infections. And in 42 years as a registered nurse, when I had somebody come in with a fractured pelvis or a fractured hip, never once have I considered sexual abuse. But if you think about it, the perpetrator is generally younger, healthier, and stronger, and on top. I just wonder how many were missing that we hadn't even thought about it. Financial exploitation, I could put one word up there. I could put theft. I could put stealing. It's taking what doesn't belong to you. The most horrendous case that I personally was involved in was a friend of mine. We worked together at the hospital. She had a lot of health challenges, and so she had retired early. She asked her best friend to be her power of attorney, and she did a great job. She was not violating that right and that privilege. But my friend's son lived out of state. He called the power of attorney and said, I want some of Mom's money. The power of attorney said, I can't give it to you. Now, if you call your mom and ask her, and she calls me to tell me it's okay, then I can send you the money. Otherwise, I can't give you her money. Instead of doing that, he and his wife came back from Colorado, walked into Mom's house, grabbed her cat, slit its throat, and said, and if you don't change power of attorney to me, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. And she knew he meant it. So she changed power of attorney from her best friend, who was doing a great job, to her son. They locked her in a back bedroom, and they began selling everything she owned. Until she got help, it was the last time that she got to have any phone calls or any visitors. She knew by the time that they had sold everything she owned, she probably would end up like her cat. She told her son that she was very ill, and if she didn't get to see a doctor right away, she was going to die. Since he hadn't cashed out the cash cow, he brought her to the emergency room. She knew this was my soapbox, and when she got there, she said, "Quick, get a hold of Di, I'm in trouble." One of the biggest problems when we're talking about adults and adult children as the abusers, I honestly do not know an adult that will file charges against their child. You know, we always hope for the best. They'll change. They'll see the light. There's going to be something different there. And so I do not know an adult that will file charges against their child. So because she refused to file charges against her son and her daughter-in-law, her attorney and law enforcement put the biggest restraining order out I've ever seen. It was the entire state of Iowa. You get back to Colorado and you stay there. If we ever catch you across the border, we will arrest you regardless of what your mom wants. I checked on it. It is legal. For the next 6 years, Mom never saw her son again. She talked to him on the phone periodically, but she also knew she was safe. You know, and so financial exploitation can be a major problem. Follow the money. Some of the other things that are known for theft, not only the money, assets, personal property, medications. All medications now have a very good street value. And so medications are high on the list as far as what people are stealing. Property. I was going to be doing training in a facility, and the head of maintenance told me he was very glad I was teaching the class. He said that about 2 months before Christmas, they send letters to all of the relatives and the friends of all of their residents to tell them not to bring Christmas presents. He said because we can guarantee by 2 weeks after Christmas everything will be gone. The theft rate at that facility was so high that they sent letters out. You know, they weren't dealing with the issue. You know, and so there's problems there with it. Denial of critical care. Denial of critical care by the caretaker is basically the same for adults as it is for children. It's denial of the basics. Okay, it's our human rights. The youngest perpetrator I have ever met was 4 years old. It was a situation where his mother had promised her mother, the little boy's grandmother, that she would never institutionalize her. When his mom made that promise, you know, he didn't realize that Grandma was going to become an Alzheimer's victim and was going to burn down an apartment complex by accident. You know, Grandma wouldn't have remembered that promise, but the little boy's mother did. So she moved Grandma into their home. Home was a 2-bedroom house with Mom, Dad, a newborn, and a 4-year-old. Where are you going to put Grandma? So they moved the little boy out of his room. He had to sleep on the couch. But there wasn't space for his toys or his clothes, so they stayed in what had been his room. He had to wait till Grandma got up and got dressed before he could change clothes, before he could go play with his toys. And he became very resentful. Grandma had won, he had lost. And he became a hit and run. His mom thought that her mother, the grandmother, was, just because of Alzheimer's, was tripping and falling because she would hear, thud. It wasn't until one day as she was coming into the living room, she saw her 4-year-old hit, kick, and shove Grandma down. If she had ignored that and had not done anything to get any help, bring any attention to that, and someone else had made the report, she would have been charged with denial of critical care, child abuse, for lack of supervision on her son. She would have been charged with denial of critical care, dependent adult abuse, for lack of supervision and care of her mother. But then there is a type of denial of critical care that we have in adult abuse that we never have in child abuse, and that is self-denial. As Americans, as adults, we have the right to abuse ourselves. We have a right to eat what we want, to dress what we want. We have a right to live in those pit houses that you saw in the photos. We have those rights. There's only 2 times that anybody can do anything about that. One is if the garbage and the rodents have infestation is severe enough to be a public health issue. Department of Public Health can come in. It doesn't matter if that dependent adult is confused or disoriented. It doesn't matter. Department of Public Health can only temporarily remove them, relocate them, usually get a lot of volunteer help to pick up the whole place, to clean it up. That person is allowed to return home because Department of Public Health is civil code. They cannot change that picture other than cleaning it up. The only time it can be a permanent solution is if someone takes that dependent adult to court. Usually it's in a guardianship procedure. and the judge says you are legally adjudicated incompetent. It's a legal ruling. At that time, the judge will say you either need to get services in the house to take care of the dependent adult. If they're not available, you can't do that. The dependent is going to have to be institutionalized. That is a legal ruling. Unfortunately, families get caught on it. Physicians get caught on it. It's a desperate situation, and what can we do? Okay. And someone will make that decision to transfer that adult when, in fact, they probably do not have the legal right to do that. I started out talking about at the very beginning that I am a registered nurse, but I am not a mandatory reporter. And that's because of the definitions and end of the law. I always was a mandatory reporter until I changed jobs. And now with my job, I don't have the faintest idea how old anybody is. I don't know if anybody's dependent or not, because it has nothing to do with what I do with my job. And so from a definition standpoint, the Department of Human Services, who have always had the dependent adult and the child abuse laws, their definition has always been, in the course of employment, you examine, attend, counsel, or treat a child or a dependent adult, you are a mandatory reporter. Well, and a lot of people are going, okay, well, that doesn't fit me. I'm not a mandatory reporter. Well, there's another law. Department of Inspections and Appeals have always said mandatory reporter are staff, or therefore staff are mandatory reporters. The definition of staff is everybody that works in a licensed facility or program. Your medical centers, your nursing facilities, all assisted living, adult daycare, adult group homes, all staff. Who mows the lawn, who does the laundry, who cooks the food, who passes out the medications, are all mandatory reporters. Okay, so now you're covered potentially under that. Well, the Department of Corrections, especially like your parole, probation, they are not mandatory reporters by the law because it's criminal law instead of civil. So they have a set of administrative rules that say you are mandated to report. Okay, see, there's a variety of departments involved in this. The definitions are off just a little bit. So check in, what do you do? Medical, law enforcement, education, child care, social services, mental health. Those are the 6 big topics, but everybody in a licensed facility and program is a mandatory reporter. And then if you believe that it is happening, you have to make that report. So then if, say, myself, I'm no longer a mandatory reporter, then I am a permissive reporter. I have legal permission to make a report. Or if you're a mandatory reporter by definition of the law, but you're off duty. A lot of times I'll have people say, well, I take call. Well, okay, just because you take call doesn't make you a mandatory reporter. When you get called, if part of your job is telephone counseling, where you're dealing with someone, children, or definitely with dependent adults on the phone, you are a mandatory reporter at that time. Otherwise, if you're on call and you have to travel to get to your place of employment, EMS, your surgical techs, surgical fields, anything that's on call from those standpoints, you're not a mandatory reporter till you get back and are doing something with your job. I absolutely love Halloween. It's my favorite time of year. And I found absolutely this coolest thing. It's this mummy. It's like 4.5 feet tall. Top of its head's gone. It's a candy dish, and it is just like so cool, but it wouldn't fit in my cart. And so I tucked it under my arm, and I was walking through this store, pushing my cart, and this lady comes flying out of the clothes, and she got within 6 inches of me, and she's yelling at me. And all of a sudden she backed off and she said, "I'm so sorry. I'm a mandatory reporter for child abuse, and I thought you were dragging your grandson by his head." Okay, first of all, she's not a mandatory reporter. We are in a store. I didn't take time to do any child or dependent adult abuse training on the spot, but I did go home and check all my grandkids, and they all have the tops of their heads. She's not mandatory reporter in those particular cases. But unfortunately, people think they are. And once they have that label, they assume that it's 24 hours a day. So who makes the report? Who suspects? If you are aware of it, you make the report. But it would be, I highly recommend you let your supervisor know. You make sure that everybody up that chain of command is aware that you're making the report. The worst thing that can happen is that you've made a report, nobody knows about it. Inspections and Appeals or Human Services come in for an inspection. That's one of the worst things that can happen. Make sure that they are aware. You can help protect the evidence. You can make sure the documentation is in order. Be prepared for it. There had been a train of thought that it was just whoever was at the top of the chain of command made that report. But unfortunately, there were a lot of times it's like, ooh, your reputation is involved, etc. So it's gotten, a little gray. Make that responsibility yours. Make the report. Let somebody else know. So that likewise, call law enforcement. If at any time you feel like you are being threatened or the child or the dependent adult are being threatened, get law enforcement involved. If you're medical center based, chances are you've got hospital security. Call them first. Let them go ahead and get local law enforcement. But you have the right to be protected. As far as when do you do it, when do you make it, the law says immediately, which basically has been defined as 24 hours. And that's 24 hours from when you become aware of the abuse situation that you make that report. That actually gives you some time to think it through, take down notes, be prepared to write it out. It doesn't have to be an immediate panic action. You have time to think it through. But there's 24 hours. And then 48 hours. 48 hours from the time that you were aware, not 48 hours from the time you picked up the phone to make that call. You make a written report. It can be written online. It can be written up. I'll show you some forms, but it could be on your own documentation, your run reports, consultation forms, progress notes, anything like that, as long as it details out everything you know about that abusive situation. It could actually be a letter, almost a to whom it may concern, as long as you detail all of it out. But basically, why not use a form? You do have access to both a child and a dependent adult abuse forms. The forms are online, and I'll show you the websites in a little bit. Most employers, they should have them available if they don't. But so it's something that you could actually do a form. It's going to basically run you through the questions that they're going to ask. Okay, so you have to make the report, get law enforcement if you're in trouble and danger, let someone else know you're doing it. The 24 and 48 hours are really critical to it because there are some potential problems if you fail to do that. If we have enough evidence to say that it happened, it's going to come back as a founded report. The perpetrator's name is going to be on the Central Abuse Registry for the next 10 years. That's at a minimum. If they re-abuse, re-offend, that 10 years can start all over again. They can just continue to stack those charges. The only exception to that, to being on the registry, is a self-denial of critical care. That person, that victim, not only is abusing themselves, so they are the perpetrator as well as the victim. They're not going to be on the Central Abuse Registry, and that exception makes sense. There's going to be times when we know it happened, we know the abuse happened, but it might be minor. It might be a minor cut, a minor bruise. It might be isolated. It wasn't that severe, and it was just one of those, it just happened type of moments. And there's a probability it's not going to happen again. When we have those circumstances, yes, we know it happened, but it was minor, isolated, and unlikely to reoccur. It's going to be confirmed, yes, it happened, but that the perpetrator's name will not be on the Central Abuse Registry. They're just going to hang on, Department of Human Services just going to hang on to those reports, to track on it for the potential of future problems. And then it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but there are times we just don't have the evidence to say that it did happen. And those are the cases that are the hardest to deal with. You know that it happened. You just can't prove it. And those are the cases. If you truly believe that abuse is occurring and it's coming back as unfounded, call back, ask to speak to a supervisor. You can go all the way up the chain of command. You can call back and ask to speak to a department director. If you truly believe that there is an issue there, follow through with it so we can hopefully protect a child or a dependent adult. So then what happens? As a mandatory reporter, you are mandated to report 24 hours, 48 hours. If you fail to make that report, you can be held legally liable. One for not making the report. It's a simple misdemeanor. It is the same charge basically as if you have a dog off the leash. I mean, we're not talking about a major problem, except it is on your criminal record the rest of your life. It's a simple misdemeanor. The other part of it is it's going to potentially cost you $650 and 3 days in jail for failing to make that report. It could become more severe depending on what's happening. You can also be held legally liable for damages done. So say I'm aware that Harvey is being beaten today and I don't do anything about it. And you take care of see Harvey on Friday and you know he's being beaten and you report it. If it can be proven that I was aware and didn't report it, I'm legally liable for anything that happens to Harvey between today and Friday. What if Harvey's has been beaten to death in the next couple of days? I'm legally responsible for wrongful death. False reporting, you're also responsible for that. Again, it's going to be a simple misdemeanor. Where we see it most often in facilities is generally some type of a problem. Usually it's like 2 female nursing employees, nursing assistants, and you hire a new orderly. You know, there's the jealousy springs. If I rat out my coworker, if she's out of here, he's all mine. Dumb reasons, but we see it happening. Where we see it happening most frequent in child care is during a child custody battle. You know, if I can get the spouse out of the way because of an abuse report, I get custody. False reports is a simple misdemeanor, minimum $650 and 3 days of jail time. So you have legal obligations. So then who do you make the call? Who do you report to? We do have the 2 laws. We have Department of Human Services that investigates community abuse, and we have the Department of Inspections and Appeals that investigates licensed programs and facilities in Iowa. So if it's something that's happening out and about in homes out in the community, you see it happening even in doctor's offices because it's not licensed facility. You see it out community-wise. It's not facility program-based. That call is going to go to the Department of Human Services. If, in fact, the abuse is happening by staff of a facility, once again, medical centers, nursing facilities, assisted living, adult daycare, adult group homes, those reports go to the Department of Inspections and Appeals. If it's found that the abuse has been perpetrated by a visitor, that goes back to the community. So it can still get a little confusing. Make the call. If you've called the wrong person, the wrong State Department, the wrong number, they'll either let you know who you need to call, or they're going to help you with that, and they're going to refer the call. With the Department of Human Services, we used to be able to call locally. Until July of 2010, it went to a central intake, so you could only use the 800 number since July of 2010. One central intake, and then they disseminate the information from there. And both state departments do have online information, online forms. I have a short scenario, and I'm done. I already told you about my 18-month-old grandson that was a good probability of being sexually assaulted at daycare. I do have 5 children. All 5 of my kids are victims of child abuse. The oldest 2 children are biologically mine. My youngest 3 kids are stepchildren who are being abused by their mother, my kids by their dad. When one of my guys was 14, he said, "Mom, I need to talk to you." He said, "I don't know whether I dreamed it or whether it really happened. I was running up a flight of stairs knowing I needed to get to you before Dad got to me, or I was going to be hurt again." He said, "Did I just dream that, or did it happen?" I said, "Honey, you were 4 years old, and it was the last night we lived with your dad." He stopped and he thought. He said, "I don't need to talk about it anymore, Mom. I remember." He was 4 the last time it happened. He was 14 the only time he ever talked to anybody about it, myself or my husband about it. All my other 4 kids have never discussed abuse with any of us. All 5 kids are married. All 5 kids have talked to their spouse about it. I know because they've talked to me. All 5 of my children have children of their own, and all 5 of them know they have a 50% chance of becoming an abusive parent based on their background. My dad has always been my hero. I was the first person in my family to go on to education beyond high school. Every time I changed jobs, my dad would be the first person there saying, "Honey, give me a tour." My dad became a dependent adult. My dad chose not to tell me that he was in trouble. A neighbor called me to tell me that my dad was being deliberately starved to death by my stepmother and one stepsister who is a registered nurse. My dad lived in Arizona, 1,500 miles away. When I got down there the next morning on an emergency flight, I hadn't seen my dad for almost 6 months. He had been 6 feet tall the last time I saw him. He was down to 4.5 feet. Because of starvation and dehydration, he had started to contract. My dad couldn't straighten upright to look me in the face to talk to me. I had to kneel down on the carpet to talk to my dad. He had been 175 pounds. He was down to 115. He had lost 60 pounds in under 6 months. He had reached what the hospital called critical mass. He had a decubitus the size of a grapefruit on his coccyx, his tailbone. The hospital said, Di, we're going to work for survival. If he survives, we'll deal with abuse. My dad died. There was $84,000 missing from his account upon his death. Follow the money. This is now part of my job. I continue to teach because of what has happened with my grandson, my children, and my dad. And I want you to stop and think about it, to take this beyond a mandatory requirement for your job. I want you to go home and I want you to look at your own family, because I can guarantee one of you that sees this or more is going to be able to find abuse in your own family. And then I need you to look through your neighborhood, because someone is going to say we're missing the children or something's going on with the dependent adult. And then you need to look at your job, because I can guarantee somebody is going to find abuse within their own organization. I know, because I've been teaching for over 30 years. Make it a responsibility. Do something about it and report. And I'm off my soapbox.